Hello, and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. This podcast is an extension of that ministry. Each week, I record what I plan to share in my church on the coming Sunday. You are listening to this recording. But before we dive in, I'd like to give a shout out to our producers at Wish TV, a local news station here in Indianapolis. They head the All Indiana Podcast Network, of which the Northwood Podcast is a part. We are so grateful to them for hosting and distributing our podcast. If you'd like to check out more of their offerings, please go to www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. And there you can peruse the variety of their offerings. And while we're talking podcasts, if you like, you should subscribe to or follow the Northwood Podcast on whatever app you use to listen. This way, you'll be notified whenever a new episode is posted. Also, we encourage you to please share our podcast with your friends or whoever you think might benefit from a listen to what we have here or may enjoy what they find here. If you'd like to learn more about our church, Northwood Christian Church, our values, or our community impact, please visit our website at www.indncc.org. That's www.indncc.org. There you can find live streams of our services as well as information about our efforts to impact the community for good. Or you could learn more by writing into me, Heath Jones, directly. My email is Heath, Heath, at INDYNCC. That's Heath at indncc.org. And that's enough throat clearing for now. It's time to get to the meat of the podcast. But before we do, we've got to listen to some ads, so we'll catch you after the break.
Your day moves fast. Your news should too. That's why there's a new and improved Wish TV app, bringing you more local news, breaking alerts, live streaming, weather forecast, radar, and Indiana sports, all in one place. Customize your news feed to see the stories that matter most to you and get the information you need when you need it. Download the new and improved Wish TV app today on iOS or Android and take News 8 with you everywhere.
And we're back. And today, we're going to be considering a pivotal passage in Matthew's Gospel found in chapter 16, verses 13 through 20 of that book. Here, Jesus poses a profound question to his disciples about his identity. Everything from the location of the story to the answers to Jesus' questions illumine the person of Jesus, who he is and what he means. So let's get right to it. And as I said, the story is found in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20, and I'll read that passage for you now. It goes, "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. I extend the question to you. Who do you say that Jesus is? You probably have an idea or some concept of your own personal opinion of his identity. And if you were asked the question, and I'm asking you now, how do you answer? If I were to put this question out to the broader public and ask people to write in or to call in with their answer, I shudder to think about some of the responses that I might get. I'm not doing that, and I'm not asking for people to answer the question to me directly, but rather ask it of themselves. But if you did write in, or if you did call in, I'd have to brace myself for a wide variety of answers. Because opinions about who Jesus was or is, they run the gambit. And I'd just like to go over a few that I've run across. For some, Jesus is something like a life coach, someone who will serve to make an individual's life better. The relationship between this individual and Jesus tends to be one-on-one, and Jesus tends to say the sort of things that make us feel happier, calmer, more fulfilled, successful, confident, and overall emotionally well. And if someone who thinks this way also carries with this outlook the belief that Jesus represents God, then God tends to get shrunk down to some form of cosmic self-help guru. For others, Jesus functions something like the mascot for prosperity and wealth. This view tends to make little of the bulk of stories, teachings, and sayings about Jesus that eschew wealth and warn of its dangers. Rather, those who hold this view believe that Jesus wants them to be financially and overall materially wealthy. What's more, having wealth serves as a sign of God's approval and blessing. Conversely, poverty serves as a sign of God's rejection and curse in this view. Others see Jesus as just the nicest guy. He's the penultimate live and let live sort of hippie. He swears that if we could just get along, then we'd be all right. This Jesus is agreeable, polite, non-confrontational, and affirming. But this view can be one-dimensional, detached from Jesus' demands, judgments, provocative teachings, and anger at injustice. Biblical scholar Dan Clendenin writes of this Christ image, "It's hard to imagine why such a harmless person would be arrested by Rome, beaten to a pulp, and crucified as a criminal. He wouldn't hurt a flea." This Jesus will not call us toward radical transformation or confront the powers of evil in the world, but would rather make daisy chains with us on a spring day. But there are other Jesus images. For some, Jesus is a judgmental gatekeeper. This Jesus tells us who's in and who's out of the God Club. We learn from this Jesus who we should avoid to preserve our sanctity and our salvation. Those who conceive of Jesus primarily in this way emphasize Jesus' calls towards righteousness, but righteous living is so narrowly defined that many, if not most, are left on the outside looking in. Moral living is so narrowly defined that very few can make the mark, and even those who claim to do so often live hypocritically. Still, some others see Jesus as a great culture warrior. This Jesus is primarily concerned with defeating the quote-unquote other side in our political battles and our cultural battles. This Jesus just so happens to vote like us, think like us, and advocate for just what we'd like to see happen. This person knows who Jesus would prefer as president, for instance. One Jesus image that I've grown quite concerned about is Jesus as a bigger and better Captain America. In the minds of some, Jesus is basically an American patriot, but on a divine scale. The Star-Spangled Banner is just as much a hymn for some as Amazing Grace. In fact, the two may be sung interchangeably. This Jesus is concerned with defending our borders and economic interests more broadly, and ours specifically, to the cost of others. This Jesus goes out with American soldiers when war is raged in diverse places. I personally firmly place this Jesus in the category of idolatry, and I'll not get into it more now. But not all of these Jesus images are wholly idolatrous. Some of them capture some of the essence of who Jesus is, albeit not all of who Jesus is. But others seem so out of step with the Jesus we find in the Gospels that one wonders if those who hold them are reading the same Bible that we are. Well, for some clarity, let's look to the Bible. More specifically, let's look to the Jesus as revealed in today's Gospel reading from Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. This text contains many clues to the question, who is Jesus, especially when placed in the context of the Gospel of Matthew as a whole literary unit, and also placed in the context of all the scriptures that Jesus would have been aware of at the time of his saying these things. I'd like to move through today's text in a largely verse-by-verse fashion to see if we can't all come away with our view of Jesus coming into better focus. Perhaps some of us will be challenged and others affirmed. In either case, let's begin at verse 13, which reads, if you remember, "Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?'" This geographic location is significant in uncovering part of Jesus' identity here. To explain, I'll quote Bible scholar Audrey West, who writes, "Situated about 25 to 30 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, Caesarea Philippi was near a trade route that connected Tyre in the west to Damascus in the northeast. Signs of power and authority were on display. A couple of decades before Jesus' birth, Herod the Great had built a temple near the spring in honor of Caesar Augustus. By the time Jesus and his disciples visited the region, Caesarea Philippi had been given over to the auspices of Herod's son, Philip the Tetrarch, who established the city as the administrative center of his government. By the time the Gospel of Matthew was written, people were likely aware that the Roman commander who led the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE had returned with his troops to Caesarea Philippi in celebration of their victory. End quote. As I said before the quote, the place Peter's identification of Jesus, or where he makes that identification, this location geographically, is significant. Here is a place that is an epicenter of Roman imperial power. To name Jesus as the Messiah in this place puts him and what he represents in contrast with what Rome and its empire represent. This place screams loudly by way of its art, its palace, its buildings, architecture, and the Roman soldier stationed there that Caesar is the Son of God. Not Jesus, Caesar, the God King. This geographical spot is something like a shrine to this claim. For Peter to suggest another Messiah or anointed one is to relegate Caesar down from his pedestal and to elevate Jesus in his place. A claim that raises Jesus above the God King Caesar was dangerous to make in this place. But let's keep moving. Well, now the stage is set, and Jesus asks the question, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples begin to chatter in their answers. "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets," they say in verse 14. And they are verbalizing here the word on the street, what they've picked up through the grapevine, as they say. Whether or not people thought Jesus a literal reincarnation of these historic figures, now dead, is unclear, but what is clear from these answers is that people believe Jesus to be at least from their lineage, that is, from the same tradition and customs, and that Jesus is one who holds the same values as they did. In naming these martyrs as possible identifiers of Jesus, they are making the claim that the spirit of these unstoppable voices is alive and well in Jesus. If you want to know who Jesus is, in part, look to the history of these great titans of faith, these prophets who stood in places like Caesarea Philippi and spoke truth to power. But Jesus is more than this, which is why Peter's answer matters here. After the disciples' answer, Jesus turns the question to the disciples in asking, "Who do you say that I am?" Who do you say? Not them, but you. To this question, Peter chimes in, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." I'll deal quickly with the back half of this statement. As was alluded to earlier, Son of God was a claim Caesar made of himself. In so doing, he was claiming a divine status. To call Jesus this is to place him and higher authority than the most powerful ruler in the known world. Peter is speaking dangerously here. This is insurrection talk. This would be like naming Jesus as ruler in a land where the despot brooked no comparisons or competition, which it so happened the Caesar brooked no comparisons or competition. This would be to knock the aspiring God King down more than a peg or two. I could say more in this vein, but I want to focus more on the term Messiah. For by Jesus' day, this word was laden with heavy meaning. Taken alone and out of context, the word Messiah is banal enough. The Hebrew word Mashiach simply means anointed one, or more literally, one who is anointed with oil. It comes from the practice of anointing someone with oil, setting that person apart for a particular office or purpose. Priests were anointed. Kings were anointed. The Bible can therefore speak of more than one Messiah, or even more than one type of Messiah. It was not originally an exclusive title for one particular person who would someday come and save the world. So at its most basic, to call someone a Messiah was to say, here is someone whom God has set apart and called for a particular purpose. So far, so good. But as the centuries passed, the word Messiah began to gather around itself an extraordinary collection of hopes. Israel had known war. Israel had known conquest. Israel had watched armies march across its land and foreign empires carry its people away. And yet the prophets dared to imagine that God was not finished. Isaiah envisioned a shoot growing from the stump of Jesse, a descendant of David upon whom the Spirit of God would rest. And what would characterize his reign? Well, he would judge the poor with righteousness and give justice to the meek of the earth. We read in Isaiah chapter 11. The prophet Jeremiah dreamed along similar lines. The day would come when God would raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who would rule wisely, execute justice and righteousness, save Judah, and allow Israel to live in safety. The hope of the Messiah, then, was not merely the hope that God would send Israel an especially religious person. It was the hope that God would send someone through whom God would finally begin setting things right. And what would the world look like when things were finally set right? This is where the prophets became almost breathtaking in their imagination. Isaiah says that under the reign of this coming descendant of Jesse, the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the young goat, and a little child will lead them. The imagery is poetic, of course, but the point is unmistakable. The old arrangement of predator and prey, violence and vulnerability, would no longer have the final word. They will not hurt or destroy on God's holy mountain, we read in Isaiah chapter 11. Elsewhere, Isaiah imagines a Davidic ruler whose reign will be marked by endless peace, established and upheld with justice and righteousness. And Zechariah pictures the coming king riding humbly on a donkey while God removes the chariot, the war horse, and the battle bow. This king will proclaim peace to the nations. This was no small hope. It was a dream of a world in which the machinery of violence itself would finally be dismantled. So by the time we arrive in the world of Jesus, the hope for God's coming anointed one had become, in broad strokes, a profoundly liberative hope. The Messiah was associated with the conviction that God would not permit oppression, injustice, occupation, fear, and violence to reign forever. Jeremiah could imagine God breaking the yoke from Israel's neck, bursting its bonds, ending foreign domination, and allowing the people finally to live without anyone making them afraid. Ezekiel could dream of God's people gathered and restored under a Davidic shepherd, living securely in covenant of peace. Different Jewish communities would understand these hopes differently, and we should not pretend that there was one universally agreed upon description of the Messiah, but the great prophetic dream running beneath them is difficult to miss. Broadly speaking, God would act, God would liberate, God would establish justice, God would bring peace, God would make a world in which people no longer needed to be afraid. And it is with centuries of hopes such as these echoing in the background that Peter looks at this itinerant preacher, a poor man from Nazareth, and makes the staggering declaration of Jesus, "You are the Messiah. You are the one who will bring about these times that we have been pining for." And Jesus lived into these expectations. Where the Caesars of the world brought violence, Jesus brought peace. Where the heartless of the world brought neglect, Jesus attended to the needs of the people. Where the rule of Caesar brought injustice, Jesus brought the truth to injustice and demanded the right thing be done. Jesus was anointed by God to do these things, set apart by God to do these things. And this is what it means to call Jesus Messiah. This to say, Jesus is far more than a life coach, far more than a mascot for prosperity and wealth, far more than the nicest guy, far more than a judgmental gatekeeper, far more than a great culture warrior, and far more than a bigger and better Captain America or an American patriot. Some of these images get Jesus almost entirely wrong. Others may capture some small piece of the truth, but then mistake that piece for the whole. None of these things, taken alone, is sufficient to describe the one Peter calls the Messiah. Each can become a way of shrinking Jesus down until he fits comfortably inside our own needs, desires, our politics, our prejudices, and expectations. But if Jesus is the Messiah, then he is God's anointed one, and he is anointed for far more than making me happy personally, making me wealthy, affirming everything I already believe, telling me whom to condemn, winning my political battles, or blessing my nation. To call Jesus the Messiah is to claim that he is the one anointed by God to announce and embody God's great work of setting the whole world right. He comes proclaiming good news to the poor, release to the captive, sight to the blind, and freedom for the oppressed. He welcomes those who have been pushed to the margins and restores people to community. He feeds the hungry, heals the sick, confronts religious hypocrisy, challenges the powerful, and announces a realm in which the first are made last and the last are made first. A reversal of all that is wrong and broken in this world. And while so many had dreamed of a Messiah who would overcome violence through greater violence, sometimes that's the only way we can conceptualize these sorts of changes. But no, Jesus embodies another way. He teaches his followers that the way is through loving their enemies, blessing those who persecute them, putting away the sword, and becoming peacemakers. This is the Messiah Peter sees standing before him. God's anointed one through whom the ancient hope of liberation, justice, restoration, and peace is taking flesh. To confess that Jesus is the Messiah, then, is to confess that in him we see what God's salvation looks like, and to recognize that it may look very different from the salvation we would have designed for ourselves. How you see Jesus will determine how we follow him. If our image of him is askew or damaging or incomplete, we may well become like those who wield his name to suit their own ends, whether political, pious, or personal. So we've got to get this right. Fortunately, the stories about Jesus and about God's realm provide us a clear enough picture for us to gain a life-giving image of him. It's for us to throw in with the Jesus Peter saw and claimed as Messiah, the Savior of humankind. When Peter rightly identified Jesus, Jesus went on to say that Peter was a rock on which he would build the church. And by the way, that's us. We are the church. And we are built on this foundation. In short, we, the church, are built on these claims about Jesus. Jesus would go on to describe the ways that we would bind up the sins of our times and our culture and loosen the chains that oppress the peoples. Weave the keys to the kingdom, meaning that what we do as disciples of Jesus has eternal and lasting consequences. And we will do the things that Jesus has called us to do as his disciples, as his hands and feet and mouthpiece, if we have the right idea of who Jesus was and what he came to do. Of this idea, Bible scholar Mitzi J. Smith writes, quoting, "The heavens are witnesses of the people and things that we imprison and the people and things that we set free. When we restrict justice to the dominant and powerful and release or enact unjust laws that impact the most vulnerable among us and in the earth, heaven knows and is impacted too." Matthew's Jesus said, when you have treated the most vulnerable, the stranger/foreigner, the imprisoned, those with no homes, the hungry, and those without clean, affordable water, when you have treated them with compassion, justice, and human care, you have done so to me, says Jesus. What we do on earth matters, and it has an impact in the heavens and in the atmosphere around us. End quote. To claim Jesus as Messiah along with Peter is to join with him in that work. We become part of the rock, the movement towards justice and right living that Jesus embodied. The keys to God's realm and God's ways are in our hands. A lot hangs on what we do. Will we live into our identity in Christ? All this to say, in closing, I have by no means described all that Jesus is here. There is a lot more left on the table and a lot more I could say, but I've tried to paint in broad enough strokes for us to get the overall picture. And even still, I'm not sure I can even get my mind around it. But I hope I've painted something like a clearer picture. Jesus is the Son of the living God, the one who best embodies the ways and values of God in God's realm. He is the Messiah, the anointed one to save us. We too can join with Peter and other disciples in seeing Jesus in this way. Will you join with Peter and other disciples in seeing Jesus in this way? And so I end with the question that Jesus asked and leave it for you to answer. Who do you say that he is? More still, how does this understanding call you to live? This has been the Northwood Podcast. Please subscribe or like our podcast if you like what you hear, or visit our website at www.ndncc.org. That's www.indyncc.org. Or email me directly at Heath, Heath, at ndncc.org. That's Heath at ndncc.org. We hope that you've enjoyed this episode and will join us next week when we release the next one. Until then, peace.